As I greet people in South Africa, I greet you by saying, how's it? And welcome to lesson 18 of this basic biblical Greek course. We've made a lot of progress so far, so well done as you have continued to persevere. And today's lesson is really a consolidating lesson, a lesson in which we will review the various verb paradigms that we've learned so far. But it's also going to be a lesson in which we tie some loose ends together. And even though these loose ends are small concepts, they are important concepts nonetheless that we need to learn. And those include things such as principal parts, future deponents, crosses and special uses of kai, as well as two-termination adjectives. And once we've done that, we will learn some new vocab and then practice translating the Greek text together. So let's get going. So I'd like to begin the revision of the verb paradigms by talking about the primary and secondary endings again. Now, some of you might have these endings down, but others of you are yet to realize the importance of learning them. A student of mine recently said to me that as he has grown in his understanding of the basics of the Greek verbs, he's realized that the bridge that he has been building is not as strong as he would like it to be. And the reason for that is because he hasn't nailed down the primary and secondary endings. And so guys, I cannot overemphasize the importance of learning these endings, because once you have them down, it's going to make conjugating Greek verbs a lot easier for you. So the primary endings, once again, they are used on the unaugmented tenses. So in other words, tenses that are not focusing on past action. So in the indicative mood, these are the present, the future, and perfect tense forms. Just remember regarding the perfect tense form, yes, it is an action that takes place in the past, but the author is stressing the continuous result that comes from that past action. So that's why we have placed it with the primary endings. And then the secondary endings, they are used on the augmented tenses, so verbs that have actions that take place in the past. And in the indicative mood, these are the imperfect, the aorist, and pluperfect tense forms. So here is an overview of the primary and secondary endings that I've been emphasizing. And I've also color coordinated them. The primary endings are within the blue tables and the secondary endings are within the red tables. So let's go through them very quickly. So firstly, the primary active endings, the singulars. The first person singular does not have an ending per se. Second person singular is the sigma, and third person singular is the iota. The first person plural is men, second person plural te, and third person plural in si. And then the primary middle passive endings. The first person singular, my, second person singular, psi, third person singular, tai. First person plural, metha, second person plural, isthe, and third person plural, in tai. And now the secondary active endings. The singulars, first person singular is new, second person singular, sigma, third person singular doesn't have an ending per se. The plurals, first are men, second person plural te, third person plural is new. So notice there that the first person singular and the third person plural are the same. And then the secondary middle passive endings. The singulars first are main, second person singular sa, third person singular, ta. First person plural, metha. Second person plural, is the. And third person plural, in ta. All right, so you can just take time to look at the similarities between the primary and secondary active endings, as well as the primary and secondary middle passive endings, as well as some of the differences between them. But guys, I just want to continue to encourage you. If you can learn these 4 tables off by heart, most of the work for conjugating the Greek verbs is done for you. So let's go through the active indicative forms together, starting with the present active, and I'm going to run through them very quickly. So the singulars are luo, luais, luae. The plural forms, we have luamen, luete, luusin with a movable nu. Then the future active endings, the singulars, we have luso, lusais, lusei. The plural forms, lusamen, lusete, lususin. So exactly the same as the present active, except that we have the tense formative, the sigma, that shows us that it is a future tense form. And then the perfect active forms, the singulars, we have leluka, lelukas, leluken with a movable nu. The plural forms, lelukamen, lelukate, lelukasin. All right, what's important to remember here is that in the perfect tense form, you have the reduplication and the kappa alpha as the tense formative. All right, moving on to the secondary endings, beginning with the imperfect active forms. The singulars, we have eluan, elus, elun with a movable nu. The plural forms, we have eluamen, eluete, and eluan. Notice now, because we are dealing with the secondary endings, we need to have an augment. So we have an augment in front of the lambda. And now let's do the second aorist active. The reason why I do this with the imperfect is because the forms are exactly the same, except that the second aorist has undergone a stem change. That's why we're not working with lu as the tense stem. Rather, we are working now with lip to show that a stem change has taken place. So the singular forms, we have elepon, elepes, elepen with a movable nu. The plural, elepamen, elepete, and elepon. And then lastly, the first aorist active. The singulars, we have elusa, elusas, elusen with a movable nu. And then the plural forms, elusamen, elusate, and eluson. And there you can clearly see the tense formative, the sigma alpha, that shows you that this is a first aorist. And once again, we return to the tense stem lu because there's no stem change in the first aorist. Let's turn our attention now to the primary middle passive indicative forms, specifically, beginning with the present middle passive forms. The singulars are luamai, luae. Notice that because of contraction, we don't have the pure primary middle passive ending psi. We have luae. Then the third person singular is luetai. The plural forms are luametha, luesthe, and luantai. And then the perfect middle passive. So we have the singular forms lelumai, lelusai. Because the perfect middle passive doesn't have connecting vowels, we use the pure ending psi. That's the only time that we do use it. And then the third person singular is lelutai. The plural forms lelumetha, lelusthe, leluntai. And then the future middle forms. Remember, the future middle and future passive are distinct forms. That's why we do them separately. So the singulars, we have lucamai, lucei, lucetai, and then the plural forms, lusametha, lus esthe, and lusantai. And then the future passive forms, remember they are characterized by the theta, eta, sigma. So let's do the singular forms first. We have luthesamai, luthesei, and luthesetai. The plural forms, luthesametha, luthesesthe, and luthesontai. Now let's do the secondary middle passive indicative forms, beginning with the imperfect middle passive. The singular forms, we have eluarmain, eluu, and elueta. Just remember the second person singular has also undergone contraction. Remember that the pure ending is sa, and now we have the modified form as we find it in the Bible, eluu. The plural forms, we have eluarmetha, eluesthe, and eluanta. And then the first aorist. So we have the first aorist middle first. The singular forms are elusarmain, eluso, and elusata. The plural forms elusametha, elusasthe, and elusanta. And then the first aorist, first passive, the singular forms, we have eluthane, eluthase, and eluthe. The plural forms, eluthamen, eluthete, elutheson. And then the first aorist, second passive, the singular forms, we have egraphane, egraphase, egraphe. And the plural forms, egraphemen, egraphete, and egrapheson. All right, so you probably need some help again with the first aorist and the different kinds of passives. So let's do some revision in the next slide regarding the passives. So in lesson 15 specifically, we dealt with the types of aorist passives. So here is a summary of them once again. Firstly, the first aorist passives. All right, so the first aorist, first passive, is characterized by the fact that there is no stem change and it includes a theta. So the example there is eluthane. The first aorist second passives, once again there is no stem change, but this time it does not include a theta. So our example here is egraphane. Now, regarding the second aorist passives, specifically the second aorist first passive, it's characterized by a stem change and it includes a theta. So the example here is eichthane. So you can see that the original lexical form is ago, but it's undergone a stem change. That's why it looks so different. Now we have eichthane. And then the second aorist, second passive, is characterized by stem change, but does not include a theta. So here we have the example of estraphane. So guys, just remember these two things. Ask yourself the question, has it undergone a stem change? If it has, then it's second aorist. And does it include a theta or does it omit the theta? And if you can remember those two things, I think that you shouldn't be caught out by the different types of aorist passives. In this next section of our lesson, I'd like to answer the question, what are principal parts? Now, all verb forms are constructed on what is called principal parts. Now remember, Greek is a highly inflected language. That is, words are able to change or be altered in many different ways. So inflection refers to the spelling changes that words undergo. So here is a simple definition for principal parts. Principal parts refers to the basic inflected forms of a verb from which all forms are derived. Let me read that again for us. Principal parts refers to the basic inflected forms of a verb from which all forms are derived. Now, to help us make more sense of this definition, let's return to the English verb and look at some examples together. So English verbs have three principal parts. The first one is the present infinitive, the second is the simple past, and the third one is the past participle. So the first example is the principal parts of walk, which is a regular verb. In other words, its stem is not going to undergo any changes. So we'll be able to recognize it in the various tenses. So the present infinitive is I will walk. The simple past, yesterday I walked. And then the past participle, I have walked. Okay, so quite straightforward. Now let's look at the principal parts of go, which as we're going to see is a irregular verb. So the present infinitive is I will go. The past participle, the simple past is yesterday I went. So the question is, how do we predict that change? And the answer is we cannot. And this leads us to learn that principal parts are sometimes unpredictable in the various tenses. And this is why it's so important that we learn them. And the past participle is I have gone. So now that we've done some examples with the English verbs and their principal parts, let's now move on to the Greek verbs and their various principal parts. So let's take a look now at the Greek principal parts. So as opposed to English, Greek has 6 basic tense stems or principal parts from which all verb forms are derived. So let's go through those together. The first one is the present tense form, specifically the present active, middle, and passive. And the present is also the basis for the imperfect principal part. That's why the imperfect is not going to be included as an independent principal part. Next, we have the future active middle. Then number 3, the aorist active middle. Number 4, the aorist passive, which is also the basis for the future passive. That's why we're not going to have a separate future passive principal part. Number 5, the perfect active. And number 6, perfect middle passive. Right, so I want to just encourage you to learn those 6 principal parts systematically so that it will make conjugating and recognizing the various principal parts a lot easier. So let's just take a look at 2 examples. Firstly, the principal parts of luo. So the present is luo. The future active middle is luso. The aorist active middle is elusa. The aorist passive is eluthane. The perfect active is leluka. And the perfect middle passive is lelumai. Right, so luo is a regular verb. There's no stem change that takes place in the various tenses. And then let's have a look at the example of balo. So the present tense is balo. The future active middle is balo. remember that balo is actually a liquid verb, if you forgot, because its stem ends with a lambda. So here in the future active middle, the one lambda has dropped off, and because of contraction, we have the circumflex now. The aorist active middle is e balon, and this shows us that balo is a irregular verb because it has undergone a stem change in the aorist. So that's a second aorist. Then the aorist passive is e bleithain. The perfect active is be bleika. And the perfect middle passive is be bleimai. Right, so the perfect has the reduplication, and the perfect active has the kappa alpha tense formative. All right, but I just wanted to give you an overview of the 6 principal parts that form the basis for all verb forms. So right now, I'd like to speak to you about my strategy for helping you to learn the principal parts. So firstly, we're only going to look at the principal parts of important irregular verbs or common irregular verbs. And we're going to study them systematically in this basic biblical Greek course. And there are about 50 of them. So here's my proposed strategy to help us learn these principal parts. I would like to cover 3 irregular verbs in each lesson going forward, starting with the first 3 today. And the goal of this is not to be able to memorize each principal part, although some people have the ability to memorize them. And if you are one of those people, then by all means, please go for it. I have tried, and I really struggle to memorize all the principal parts. And so the goal is rather to be able to recognize these principal parts in the Greek New Testament. Okay, so the goal isn't primarily to memorize, but to recognize these various principal parts. So here are the first 3 principal parts that I'd like you to become familiar with and to be able to recognize when you see them in the Greek New Testament. So the first one is agaliao, which is rejoice. Number 2, angelo, which means report. And number 3, ago, which is lead. So let's go through the 6 principal parts for each one. And just before we do that, I'm just going to ask you to extend me some extra grace as I try to pronounce these principal parts going forward. Some of them are quite tricky, and I have no doubt that I will get 1 or 2 of them wrong. So just a bit of extra grace as I attempt to read them for you. So the present, we have agaliao. Future active middle, agaliasamai. Aorist active middle, agaliasa. And aorist passive, agaliathain. Now you'll see that there's no principal part for the perfect active and perfect middle passive. And this brings us to the first note here, is that not all verbs have all 6 parts. And agaliao is an example of that. Then let's have a look at angelo. The present is angelo. Future, active middle, angelo. Aorist active middle, angela. Aorist passive, angellein. Perfect active, angelka. Perfect middle passive, angelmai. You'll notice that the perfect active is in brackets, and forms in parentheses or brackets do not occur in the New Testament. So when you see a principal part in brackets, even though I want you to be familiar with it, just be aware of the fact that that principal part doesn't occur in the New Testament. And then the last example, ago, future active middle, axo, aorist active middle, agogon, aorist passive, ake thane, perfect active, aka, and perfect middle passive, ag mai. So the last point that I want to make here is just to remind you, there is no way to predict if a Greek verb will have a first or second aorist form. Okay, ago clearly has a second aorist form, but there's no way to predict that. So to be able to read Biblical Greek fluently, one must be able to recognize the principal parts of the common irregular verbs. So by God's grace and His empowering, hopefully by the end of this Biblical Greek course, you will be able to recognize the principal parts of the most common irregular verbs. So those are the first three for today. Take the time to go through them again. Remember, we're not going to try to memorize them, but simply to recognize them. So let me just remind you of what a deponent verb is again. Deponent verbs are verbs that have the form of middle or passive verbs, but the meaning of active verbs. Some common deponent verbs that we were introduced to in lesson 7 are apokrynomai, ginomai, dunamai, erkamai, and paruamai, etc. So these deponent verbs should be passed as middle or passive, but remember that they are translated with an active voice. William Mounce actually says that if the middle is deponent, you should rather pass it as a deponent and not a middle. But I'm not going to be too dogmatic about that. But it is a good habit to get into. And just remember that the only way to know if a verb is a deponent in the middle is to memorize it. All right, so now that I have reminded you of what a deponent verb is, let's take a look now at deponent futures. So what are deponent futures? Well, some verbs have deponent future forms even though they are not deponent in the present. So let me read that again for you. Some verbs have deponent future forms even though they are not deponent in the present tense. So memorize these forms in order to recognize the irregular stems and translate the verbs correctly. So these are some common future deponent forms that you need to learn. So on the left hand side, I've given you the vocabulary form or the present forms of the verbs. The middle column is the future deponent forms and then how to translate them. So let's go through them individually. The first one is apothanesko, and the future deponent form is apathanumai. Apathanumai. And if you didn't know any better, you would think that this is a present deponent verb, but it's actually a future deponent verb. And to help us to identify that, we have the circumflex there above the upsilon. But other than that, they are very irregular, and so you just need to learn them. And we translate this as I will die. Then bino becomes basamai. So that's quite an irregular one, and we translate that as I will go. Then we have gnosko, which becomes gnosamai, and we translate that as I will know. Then lambano, and the future deponent form is lempsamai. Lempsamai. I will take or I will receive. Then we have horao, which becomes opsamai. Opsaamai, and that is I will see. And then we have pipto, which becomes pesumai, pesumai, I will fall. Then pino, which becomes piamai, translate that as I will drink. And a lot of these words we'll learn in our vocab at the end of this lesson, if you were concerned. And then we have STO, and the future deponent form is very irregular. It is fugamai, fugamai, I will eat. All right, so just remember that these future deponent forms are not deponent in the present, but they are deponent in the future. But you still translate them as a future active verb. Let us now look at a concept called crasis. So what is crasis? It is the combination of two words to form one. So the combination of two words to form one. So this happens primarily with the conjunction kai when it is followed by other short words. And we'll look at a few examples in the table below. So here are the most common forms. Kai plus ego becomes ka go, and we translate that as and I. Then we have kai plus emoi becomes kamoi, and we translate that as and to me. Then we have kai plus ek, which becomes kake, and we translate that as and there. Then we have kai plus a kainos, and that becomes kakenos, and we translate that as and that one. And finally we have kai plus eon or on, and that becomes con, and we translate that variously as and if, even if, also if, depending on what best fits the context. So these crasis, kago, kamoi, kake, kakenos, and kon are the forms that you would find in the Bible. And a big clue to show you that this is a crisis is the apostrophe over the alpha, which should make it a little bit easier to recognize. Let's have a look at special uses of kai and ude when they're repeated in the same clause. So this will help with translation. The first one is kai, that is separated by a few words. And when you see that, we could translate it as both and. So here's an example. Kai hoi apostoloi, kai hoi mathetai, akuusin hemas. So instead of translating this and, we could say both the apostles and the disciples are hearing us. And then the second example of ude, separated by a few words, we could translate this as neither nor. So here's an example. Ude he meteir mu ude ha pateir mu agapa me. So this could be rendered as neither my mother nor my father is loving me. Right, so just be aware of those special uses of kai and ude when they are repeated in the same clause. So a very helpful way to learn the different Greek adjectives is to categorize them. So Greek adjectives fall into 4 categories. And this is depending on which declension they follow and whether the feminine and masculine forms are the same or different. And then also remember that the masculine and neuter always follow the same declension. So the first category is the 2-1-2. And why do we give it this numbering system? It's because the masculine gender follows the second declension, the feminine gender the first declension, and the neuter gender the second declension. And we've actually covered this category already in lesson 6 when we looked at the example of agathos, agathē, agathon, which means good. Then the next two categories, the 2-2 and 3-3, are unique. So at the bottom here, I've got a comment that I want to read to you. It says that the term two-termination adjectives refers to the categories 2-2 and 3-3 because they only have two sets of endings due to their masculine and feminine endings being the same. So you can see here for the 2-2 category that the masculine and feminine are the same because they both follow the second declension. And then for the 3-3 category, the masculine and feminine both follow the third declension. And because of that, they form one termination. And then we also have the neuter termination. So together, they are two-termination adjectives. So we'll look at these in a little more detail in the next two slides. The example of the 2-2 being aionios, aionion, and the examples of the third category being aletheis and alethes, and tis and ti, which we've already done. That was the interrogative pronoun. So at least now you know which category it follows. And then the final category, the 3-1-3, the masculine follows the third declension, the feminine the first declension, and the neuter the third declension. And the example here is pas, pasa, pan. And this is actually an adjective that we're going to spend an entire lesson on, specifically lesson 21 of this basic biblical Greek course. So just wanted to give you an overview of the different categories right now and zero in on the two-termination adjectives. So let's have a look at the example of aionios and aionion in more detail. So let's look at the adjective aionios, aionion, which means eternal. So remember that this adjective is a two-termination adjective because the masculine and feminine genders are the same. And it follows the 2-2 category because the masculine, feminine, and neuter genders ultimately all follow the second declension endings. So let's see if that is true. I'm just going to read them for us. The singular, masculine, feminine forms, we have aionios, aioniou, aionio, aionion. And the plural forms, we have aionioi, aionion, aioniois, and aionious. Okay, so that definitely is consistent with the second declension. And then the neuter singular, we have aionion, aioniou, aionio, aionion. And then the neuter plurals, we have aionia, aionion, aioniois, and aionia. All right, so I just wanted to decline that for you so that you are aware of how to do it and are familiar with the various cases. And then finally, the 3-3 adjective, aletheis, alethes, which means true. Only a small group of adjectives is declined according to the third declension, all three genders. So the most common one is aletheis. Now, since third declension adjectives are not encountered as often as those of the first and third declension, one should aim to simply recognize these forms in the Greek New Testament. So I'm going to quickly decline it for you. And if these endings still look foreign to you, then please go and watch lesson 11 again to just do some revision on the third declension endings. All right, so the singular, masculine, feminine forms, we have aletheis, alethus, alethē, alethē. The plural forms, alethes, alethon, alethesi, and alethes. Then the neuter singular, we have alethes, alethus, alethē, and alethes. And then the neuter plural forms, aleithei, aleithon, aleithesi, and aleithei. Okay, so I really just want you to be able to recognize the 3-3 adjective category, and specifically just become familiar with aleithais because it is a very common adjective. Let's take a look at our vocabulary for lesson 18. We start with the two adjectives that we've learned. So the first one is aionios, aionion, because it is a two-termination adjective with the masculine and feminine both following the second declension, and that means eternal. And then we have aleithais, aleithes, where the masculine and feminine are also the same, but they follow the third declension. And the meaning of this is true. Then we have amen, which means truly. Then we have archirus, archireos, ha, which is an example of a third declension noun. And it means high priest. And then we have bino, bino, which means I go. Next we have an adjective which follows the 2-1-2 category. Ekastos, ekaste, ekaston, which means each. Then we have exo, exo, which means outside or without, and as a preposition, it takes its object in the genitive case. And then we have an example of crucis, which is kago, and we translate that as and I, or also I also. Next we have kathos, kathos, which is what we would call a comparative conjunction, and it means just as or as. Next we have malon, malon, which is more or rather. Then we have martureo, martureo, which is where we get our English martyr from, and it means eyewitness or I testify. Next we have an adjective, monos, mone, monon, which means only or alone. Then we have proskuneo, proskuneo, which means I worship, and just take note that it takes a dative direct object. Right, pay attention to that small fine print there. And then we have pempo, pempo, which means I send. Then we have pino, pino, which means I drink. And finally we have pipto, pipto, which means I fall. So let's read our first example together. The Greek reads as follows: Ha de Jesus apen auto hoti amen amen lego soi lampse tain charin kai eis eluse eis tain basileon tu theu hei en tois uranois esten. So let's pass three words together. The first one is apen. This is a second aorist verb, active, indicative, third person singular. So you might not have recognized it immediately, and that's because it has undergone a stem change. The lexical form is actually lego, but in the second aorist it actually is based on apon, showing that there's a stem change, and we're going to translate it as said. Then the next word is lampse. This is a future verb, and I've marked it here as a deponent specifically because its future form is deponent, and it comes from lampsamai, which is an example that we did in this lesson previously. It's indicative, second person singular, and we're going to translate this as you will receive. And the last word is eis eluse. This is also a future verb. It's also deponent, but I've marked it here as middle because its lexical form Ace erchomai is already a deponent in form. And then we have its indicative, second person singular, and we're going to translate this as you will enter. So putting some of this passing information together, we could come up with a translation that goes something like this. But Jesus said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will receive grace and you will enter into the kingdom of God, which is in the heavens. So let's make one or two observations here. The first one is regarding this word hoti. Now we have been used to translating hoti as because or that, and generally that's how we will translate it. But sometimes it's also used to introduce a quotation. So in this example, it's introducing the words of Jesus. And when we do that, we put the person's word in quotation marks. All right, so just be aware of this alternative use of hoti. And then we see here that soy is functioning as the indirect object, so it's to you. You will receive what? So we have here tain charin, which is functioning as the direct object of the verb receive. And then we see tain basileon, which is the kingdom, and that is the object of the preposition ace. And then we have this relative pronoun, hey, which is referring back to, or should I say its antecedent is the kingdom of God. And then we have a linking verb here, esten, and as you've learned by now, that links two things. And we see here that the heavens would then be functioning as a predicate dative because it's in the dative case. Good. Let's do one more example together. Let's begin by reading the Greek text. It begins, en to logo tu kuriou hemon gegraptai hoti ha soteo hemon apathenetai hupe hemon kai ta soma autu egothesetai ek ton nekron. So let's pass three words together. The first one is gegraptai. This is a perfect verb. It can be a middle or passive voice, but I think the context is best suited for the passive voice. It's indicative, third person singular. So we're going to translate it as it has been written. Then we have apathenetai, which is a future verb. All right, so just pay attention to that. It is not a present, it's a future. We can see the circumflex there that helps us to show that some form of contraction has taken place. It's a middle voice, indicative, third person singular. So we're going to translate it as will die, implying he. And the last word is egothesetai. So there you see the tense formative, the theta, eta, sigma, which shows you that this is also a future verb. It's a passive voice, indicative, third person singular. And we're going to translate it will be raised with it implied. Now before I give you the translation, I just want to ask you the question, what do you think is the subject of this verse? So it begins here, en to logo tu kuriou hemon. Now remember, just because that is at the front of the sentence does not mean that it's the subject. And I can tell you now that it can't be the subject because to logo is in the dative case. So we need to find something that's in the nominative case, and we don't. Then we need to look at the actual verb, gegraptai. And we also know that verbs can actually carry the subject, which it does in this example. So the actual subject of this verb is it. It has been written. So putting this together, our translation looks something like this with our subject it. So it has been written, in the word of our Lord, and then we see hoti being used to introduce a quotation again. So we use our quotation marks. Our Savior will die for us, and his body will be raised from the dead. So please go through that translation again if you weren't too sure how we got the subject. But other than that, keep going. You are doing very, very well.